My name is Harriet Tubman. I was born enslaved on Maryland's eastern shore, in a country that spoke of freedom while keeping millions, including me, from ever touching it. I did not begin life with safety or choices. I was born into a world where people were bought and sold, where families were broken without warning, and children learned very early who had power and who did not. I learned to watch faces and listen for footsteps. I learned when to speak and when silence could save you. I learned that fear was used on purpose and that surviving meant paying attention. My life began with the world I was born into and the choices a person makes when there is no safe place to stand. Only the danger of staying and the risk of moving forward.
In the marshy lowlands of Maryland's eastern shore, the year 1822 marked the arrival of Araminta Ross. She was born into a world built like a room with no door and no key. To understand the woman who would become Harriet Tubman, we must first face the brutal reality of her prison. Dorchester County was a center for the business of buying and selling slaves. Following a ban on the Atlantic trade in 1808, Maryland became a primary export state, specializing in the theft of people to supply the lethal labor demands of the cotton and sugar plantations in the Deep South. Harriet was born into a system where the chain gang, or coffle, was a daily sight. These were men, women, and children being taken away from their families and their enslavement plantations because the law at that time said they could be bought and sold like furniture. A coffle was a long, rattling line of people, shackled by the neck and wrists with heavy iron, forced to walk hundreds of miles toward the south. The sound of those chains clinking was the terrifying music of Harriet's childhood. The men driving these lines were traders who viewed human lives as currency in a bank. They knew they could buy a child in Maryland and sell that child for a much higher price in Alabama or Mississippi. This was a calculated business of tearing families apart to make a profit. Harriet's education was not found in books. In those days, it was a crime for a slave to learn to read or write. Instead, she learned her science from her father, Ben Ross. Ben was a master woodsman and a timber manager, a man who survived by his deep knowledge of the land. This knowledge was a blend of African oral traditions passed down through generations and the practical engineering required to survive the Maryland swamps. Ben taught Harriet how to read the woods like a map. He showed her how to find the North Star to maintain her course in the dark. He taught her how to recognize the moss that grows on the north side of trees and how to distinguish between plants that could heal a wound and those that were safe to eat during a long flight. This was not folklore, it was a rigorous, survival-based education passed from father to daughter. It allowed a woman who was never allowed to learn her ABCs to out-navigate the most educated slave catchers of her time.
The weight struck my head, and the world was never the same again. The pain did not leave. It became a shadow that followed me every hour of every day. Sudden sleep would take me without warning. My head would fill with noise or spinning darkness. I learned that my body was no longer something I could fully trust. I had to learn a different kind of strength. I moved knowing rest might come at the wrong time. I planned knowing my breath might be short. The injury did not make me powerful. It forced me to become precise.
A defining moment in Harriet's life happened at a store in Bucktown, Maryland, around 1835. An enslaved man had left his work without permission, and an angry overseer was chasing him. Harriet, only a teenager, stood in the doorway and refused to help catch the man. As the slave ran for his life, the overseer grabbed a heavy metal weight from the counter and hurled it with lethal force. The heavy iron weight hit Harriet in the forehead and crushed her skull. In a world of medical apartheid, she was denied doctors or proper care and was forced back into the fields within 48 hours. To her enslavers, her value was purely physical. They saw a broken tool to be forced back into labor, not a human being in need of healing. This injury resulted in permanent neurological damage, causing her to suffer from sudden, sleeping fits for the rest of her life. These episodes often caused her vision to blur or black out entirely. Because she could no longer rely solely on her eyesight, Harriet was forced to master non-visual navigation. She sharpened her ability to navigate by the sound of water currents and the physical texture of the landscape. She memorized the distance between landmarks by counting her steps and timing her movements against the rhythm of her own breath to estimate distance when the night sky was obscured. This was a necessary adaptation. She took the very injury meant to disable her and used it to develop a level of operational precision that allowed her to move through the dark when others were effectively blind.
There comes a moment when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. In 1849, that moment came for me. My owner died. His debts remained. That meant I was about to be sold. I had seen what that meant. Being sent farther south, harder labor, never seeing your family again. I did not pray to be comfortable. I prayed to be shown the way. I understood then that freedom would not be handed to me. If I wanted it, I would have to take it. I did not know the road. I did not know who would help me. But I knew this. If I stayed, my life would grow smaller. If I left, I would at least be moving towards something of my own.
In 1849, the man who claimed to own Harriet died. His death caused a legal fire sale. To pay off the man's debts, the family decided to sell Harriet away to the brutal labor camps of the Deep South. This was a death sentence. Down in the cotton and rice fields of the South, slaves were worked until their bodies simply gave out. Disease, starvation, and the constant heat meant that once you were sold downriver, you rarely lived more than a few years. It was a fate worth dying to avoid. Harriet and her brothers, Ben and Henry, were being held on separate, nearby plantations, but they decided to run together. They didn't get far. They were hunted by patrollers, state-sponsored gangs of white men who were paid to patrol the roads and catch anyone without a pass. Terrified by the bloodhounds and the threat of a public hanging, her brothers forced Harriet to turn back with them. But she wouldn't stay. A few nights later, she walked out into the woods again, alone. It is important to know that while she left them that night, she did not forget them. Years later, after she had learned the secret ways of the woods, she would return to lead both Ben and Henry, along with their families, out of Maryland and into the north. Harriet walked 90 miles to Philadelphia with no map. She kept her eyes on the North Star to keep from walking in circles in the dark. But when she finally reached the free North, the rules changed. In 1850, the United States government passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law was a nightmare. It didn't just allow slavery, it forced it on every state in the Union. Even in places like Kansas or Pennsylvania where slavery was supposed to be illegal, the law now required every citizen to act as a slave catcher. If a black person was seen on the street, any white person could claim they were a runaway. There was no trial. There was no jury. Federal marshals were ordered by the government to kidnap these people and send them back to the South. If a neighbor tried to help Harriet, or even just gave her a piece of bread, that neighbor could be thrown in jail or fined more money than they owned. The North was no longer a safe zone, it was a hunting ground. Harriet realized that being free by herself didn't mean anything as long as her family and her people were still being hunted by the law. She saw that she couldn't just sit in Philadelphia and be safe. She had to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a name given to the secret heroes who moved people from house to house in the dark. She didn't just change her life, she became a secret soldier, breaking the law every single day to bring her people to a place where the American government couldn't touch them.
Freedom did not feel finished. I could breathe, but my people could not. My parents, my brothers, my sisters. Freedom that leaves everyone else behind feels incomplete. I knew the danger, but I also knew the land. I knew how to move quietly. I knew how fear worked. So I went back. Not once, again and again.
During the Civil War, Harriet Tubman was officially commissioned by the Union Army as a scout and spy. Her objective was not a peaceful rescue, it was a violent military disruption. She recruited a dual-track intelligence network. Women enslaved in the households of Confederate officers acted as strategic analysts, recording troop numbers and the locations of underwater torpedoes, the mines that the Confederate troops had planted on the river. 9 local black boatmen then used that data to physically probe the murky river under the cover of night. On June 2, 1863, the silence of the Combahee River was shattered. As Harriet guided 3 Union steamships, the John Adams, the Harriet Weed, and the Sentinel, around the hidden mines, the Union soldiers and the newly freed black troops opened fire. This was an armed invasion. As the steamships moved, landing parties went ashore to set the enslavement plantations ablaze. The scene was a nightmare of fire and combat. Confederate pickets and overseers did not simply stand by, they opened fire from the banks, and the Union ships returned the fire with heavy cannons. As the steam whistles blew, more than 700 people rushed from the burning fields and waded into the water to reach the boats. But the extraction was a desperate race against the clock and the tide. As the ships turned back toward the mouth of the river, they were heavy with the weight of the passengers and moving against a falling tide. The Confederate forces moved sharpshooters into the thick brush along the banks and raced to set up light artillery at the river's narrowest bends. This was the moment where Harriet's intelligence network saved the fleet a second time. Because her scouts had mapped the heights along the river, the Union gunners knew exactly where to aim their cannons before the Confederate batteries could even unlimber their guns. As the ships ran the gauntlet, the air was filled with the scream of shells and the constant whistle of bullets from Confederate rifles. The ships had to maintain a high speed to avoid being grounded on the shifting sandbars, a maneuver that required the pilots to follow Harriet's memorized landmarks through a fog of coal smoke and gunpowder. The Sentinel actually ran aground during the retreat, nearly becoming a stationary target for Confederate fire. It required a frantic effort to pull the vessel free while the other 2 ships provided covering fire, raking the treeline with canister shot to keep the enemy back. There were casualties on both sides, and the water was stained by the violence of the escape. When the ships finally cleared the mouth of the river and reached the safety of the Union-controlled Sea Islands, they were scarred by bullet holes and scorched by fire. Harriet Tubman had not just led a raid, she had successfully navigated a fighting retreat through a narrow trap. This victory was absolute. She had entered a fortress of the South, seized its labor force, destroyed its wealth, and brought her fleet back through a storm of iron. It remains one of the most successful unconventional warfare operations in American history.
When the war came, the work changed. What I knew became useful in a new way. The rivers, the roads, the people who could be trusted. Freedom was no longer something taken in silence. It became something that could be claimed openly.
Following the successful extraction of over 700 people at the Combahee River, the Union command celebrated the strategic victory but moved to erase the contribution of the woman who made it possible. Despite her rank as a scout and spy, the United States government refused to acknowledge Harriet Tubman as a soldier. Because she was a woman, and because she was black, the bureaucracy classified her service as unofficial. She returned to Auburn, New York, where she began a 30-year legal battle for her veterans' pension. Her commanding officer, General Rufus Saxton, and even the Secretary of State, William Seward, provided documented proof of her brilliance in the field. They testified that her spy network had provided the intelligence that saved Union ships and hundreds of lives. Still, the pension board remained unmoved. For decades, the government denied her the standard pay of a soldier. In the eyes of the law, her military genius did not exist. It was not until 1899, 36 years after the raid, that a special act of Congress finally granted her a meager monthly payment of $8. This was a direct insult to a master strategist who had crippled Confederate supply lines. Harriet did not allow this state-sponsored theft of her wages to break her spirit. She used her property in Auburn to establish the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, creating a sanctuary for those who had survived the horrors of the enslavement plantations. She also joined forces with Susan B. Anthony in the fight for women's suffrage, proving that the struggle for freedom did not end when the guns of the Civil War fell silent. She spent her final years as she had spent her youth, fighting a system that attempted to deny her humanity and her history. When she passed in 1913, she was buried with full military honors, a final, delayed admission from a nation that had tried for nearly a century to ignore her light.
The work left its mark on me. My body carried the cost. Freedom did not come with rest, but stopping was never a choice I was given, so I kept moving.
Harriet Tubman's recorded final words were, "I go to prepare a place for you." Her death was the closing of a chapter in the American struggle for identity. She read the stars when the world was dark, and she effectively rewrote the laws of the nation by refusing to comply with them. She remains the North Star of the American spirit, a tactical guide whose life proves that the work of establishing freedom is an ongoing, documented labor. Her life remains a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome the machinery of oppression.
I did not live my life to be remembered. I lived it because freedom was real to me. Not an idea, not a promise. Something a person could touch, step by step. Freedom cost fear. It cost pain. It cost walking into the dark without knowing what waited there. I only knew what my people needed: a path, a guide, someone willing to go first. I kept moving so others could move. I kept returning so others could leave. I carried freedom so it would not end with my steps. That is what freedom looks like. It is made, it is carried, and once it is real, it must be passed on, forward.